Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into one of the absolute most shadowy corners of recent history. As an investigative historian, my goal here is to strip away all that pop culture mythology and take a really critical look at the hidden history of behavioral conditioning. We're going to analyze the hard data, the massive institutional cover-ups, and look at how the really dark ambitions of the past actually connect directly to the systems you and I use every single day. So think about this for a second. What if the human mind wasn't just studied, but quietly weaponized? We usually think of science and psychology as these tools for healing, right? But what actually happens when human consciousness is viewed as a literal battlefield? I want you to keep this central mystery in mind as we go, because the answer is basically a mirror reflecting how modern institutions view influence. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the ambition of control. Now, most people have heard the name MKUltra, but very few actually understand how it was built. Launched back in 1953, it absolutely wasn't just some single, isolated experiment in a dark, creepy basement. Not at all. It was this massive, fragmented, and heavily compartmentalized network that spanned over 140 different sub-projects. And it was intentionally obscured by the CIA to hide its true scale, literally keeping it a secret even from the people working inside of it. So, why build this giant, secretive network in the first place? Well, in a word, paranoia. The US was convinced that its adversaries had cracked the code on mind control, and they desperately wanted to beat them to the punch. The ambition here was chilling. They wanted total control. We're talking programmed operatives who could perfectly resist hostile interrogation or even act without any conscious awareness of what they were doing. But here's the catch. While they chased this sci-fi level of total control, what they actually ended up achieving was profound influence over human perception. The goal was total domination, sure, but the reality? That became behavioral manipulation. Moving on to Section 2, Ethics Erased, the Experiments. To chase down these crazy ambitions, standard observational psychology was just thrown right out the window, completely gone. We're talking intense hypnosis. We're talking sensory deprivation specifically designed to completely break a subject's grip on reality. Sometimes they'd isolate people for weeks on end. They used aggressive psychological conditioning. And of course, most infamously, they deployed psychoactive substances like LSD. Basically, they threw literally everything they could think of at the human mind, just to see what would make it snap. There's a phrase from the history of this program that really stops you in your tracks. Consent was inconvenient to the objective. You see, these extreme methods weren't just kept in clinical environments with willing volunteers. They were frequently tested on totally unwitting subjects: civilians, medical patients, prisoners, even their own personnel. They basically decided that the end goal of Cold War dominance justified completely erasing the basic human right of consent. Now, as an investigator looking at this, it is absolutely vital to separate fact from fiction. The verified facts are damning enough. MKUltra existed, for sure, and it undeniably involved horrific, completely unethical drug testing and psychological torment. But those unproven ambitions? Despite all the atrocities they committed, the evidence for fully successful, sci-fi-style mind-controlled agents remains completely unproven. So the institutional abuses? Very real. The total success of the program? Not so much. Which brings us to Section 3, the 1973 document purge. When you map out the timeline of this cover-up, it is incredibly stark. It kicks off in the early Cold War, driven entirely by fear. That fear totally boils over into the 1950s and 60s, leading to literally decades of experiments on unwitting people. But then, fast forward to 1973, and there's a sudden, massive destruction of MKUltra documents, ordered directly by the CIA director. The trail of evidence is just deliberately set on fire. And you have to ask yourself, what did the institution actually discover that made them hit the panic button like that? Think about this quote: "Destruction of records is rarely about hiding incompetence. It's about protecting something that worked." Or, honestly, maybe something that almost worked. Because if the program was just a massive, embarrassing failure, you just bury it in some dusty bureaucratic vault, right? But active destruction? Were they hiding catastrophic failures or terrifying breakthroughs? By destroying the files, they ensured the true outcomes remain privately classified forever, locking away the real reality of what they actually learned. Let's look at Section 4, the evolution of influence. Because here is the chilling realization. Programs like this don't just disappear. They evolve. Institutional history shows us time and time again that when an entity gets close to mastering something as incredibly powerful as human perception, they don't just throw their hands up and stop. The names change, the bureaucratic oversight shifts around, the specific objectives get a little more refined, but that pursuit of power, it absolutely doesn't vanish just because someone shredded a few boxes of paper. It's really a clear progression. We start at step 1 with the brute force control of the MKUltra era, those clumsy, deeply unethical experiments. But institutions learn, and they move to step 2, refinement of objectives. They figure out that you don't actually need to create a robotic Manchurian candidate if you can just quietly guide the way an entire population thinks. And that brings us to step 3, sophisticated behavioral shaping. The clumsy sledgehammer of the past is completely replaced by the invisible, highly tuned influence tactics of the modern era. And that brings us right to section 5, invisible conditioning today. Because the modern descendants of those early influence experiments, they don't rely on hidden switches or extreme methods anymore. Today, we are talking about behavioral psychology, hyper-targeted advertising strategies, and incredibly complex algorithm design. Today's conditioning is massively scalable and just seamlessly baked right into the everyday digital systems we all interact with. Human decisions are literally being influenced at a massive scale, right out in the open. It really boils down to this. The most effective control is the kind you don't notice. The true evolution of MKUltra was never really about controlling individuals directly, it was about learning exactly how to shape our environments. Because if you control the information feed, if you control the psychological triggers, and you control the digital architecture, you naturally guide the behavior. You don't need to force someone to make a choice if you can invisibly architect the only choices they even consider in the first place. So, the failed ambition of the past was brute force domination. Getting total control of the human mind proved pretty much impossible. But the enduring reality, the thing they actually learned from erasing ethics and experimenting on humanity, is subtle, scalable influence. MKUltra proved exactly how far institutions are willing to go, and it ultimately revealed that invisible influence, not violent domination, is where true modern power really lies. So I want to leave you with this one thought. Was MKUltra a failed experiment in controlling the human mind, or was it just the messy, highly unethical first step in learning how to quietly guide it? Next time you scroll through your feeds or see a perfectly targeted ad or interact with a recommendation algorithm, just remember the history of how these behavioral sciences were forged. Stay curious, stay aware, and look really closely at the invisible conditioning around you today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.